Hello, welcome back to the second Petman Academy musicianship class. I hope you've all had a good week and managed to get some schoolwork and music practice and music lessons done, and you're starting to get used to this new normal, if you like. So today we're going to go back to where we left off last time, looking at the music of Johann Sebastian Bach and the final period of his life when he was based in the German city of Leipzig. Um, After that, we're going to move on to another very important Baroque composer, George Friedrich Handel, and his life, looking at some of the ways in which his career differed from that of Bach's. And I'll also introduce you to the Baroque orchestra and what we call period instruments. By that, I mean instruments from the Baroque times. And they actually would sound quite different to modern day equivalent. So let's get started on that. So bear with me whilst I just share my screen with you. All right, so at the end of last time, we left things with the Brandenburg concertos, and I explained about what a concerto meant in J.S. Bach's time. Now we're going to move on to another stage of Bach's career, and perhaps the most significant. In 1723, aged 38, Bach moved to the city of Leipzig, which is still just around the corner from where he was last, and he took up the post of cantor at the Thomasschule, a city where he and his pupils were supposed to provide the music for the city's 4 main churches, but principally the churches of St. Thomas and St. Nicholas. And Bach's responsibilities towards these churches resulted in an enormous output of compositions from him during this time. There were daily services in all of the churches and special celebrations at festival times. Regular Sundays at St. Thomas and St. Nicholas consisted of 3 short services, plus the main service, which began at 7 a.m. and finished about 12 noon, so it was a whopping 5 hours long. And at these services, the choir, which Bach was the director of, sang a motet, Kyrie and Gloria from the Mass, hymns, and what we call a cantata. And this is one of the main types of composition that Bach is associated with. A cantata is a sort of quasi-dramatic work where a singer or singers perform with an instrumental accompaniment. And in Bach's case, they're a little bit like dramatizations of biblical texts or similar, with solo singers, a choir, and a small orchestra. And each cantata usually lasts about 20 to 30 minutes. The churches of St. Thomas and St. Nicholas would sing a new cantata on alternate Sundays, and Bach directed at whichever church that was, whilst his deputy directed at the other church. As well as that, there were the 2 other churches that required music as well. So altogether, in the city of Leipzig, there were about 44 singers spread around the churches and instrumentalists at the church where the cantata was being featured. It's really from these cantatas that we get an idea of Bach's phenomenal compositional output. He wrote enough cantatas for at least 3 years' worth of Sunday and special services. That's quite incredible. And for a period in Leipzig, he was producing a new cantata every week. By that, I mean not just composing it, but also allowing time for the parts to be written out and then rehearsed before performing it on the Sunday. When you think about that in the modern world, that's quite incredible what Bach managed to achieve week in, week out there. So there's many different types of cantatas, but the one that we're going to look at is quite interesting because it's rather old-fashioned. And in fact, it takes us back to the medieval period of music because it uses what we call a cantus firmus, that means a fixed song or melody. In one of Bach's cantatas, he has the famous tune Ein fester Burg going through it. Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott, or a safe stronghold our God is still, is a hymn or chorale, and the words and melody of which were written by the Protestant reformer Martin Luther, so it was very important to the Lutheran Church in Leipzig. So as a guide, I've put the first part of the chorale, the notes above this, at the top of this slide. And it gets repeated when sung, and then the tune moves on to a second section. So hopefully you'll be able to follow along with that melody as we listen to it. I'm going to start off with the last movement of the cantata because that's where the choir sings a harmonized version of this chorale. Here it is. So what I want you to do is to try and keep that tune in your head, because if you do, you'll recognize it in some of the other movements that we're going to listen to. And by the way, a movement is an independent section of a piece, a bit like an act or a scene in a play. So what we just heard was the last movement. So now let's have a listen to the first. It doesn't begin with that melody that we just heard, but after about half a minute, that melody is played in the trumpets and the oboes, and you can also hear snatches of the tune in the choir, especially the ending of that phrase. So let's have a listen to this and see if you can pick some of those things out. Moving on to the second movement now, and again, keep that tune. I've written it on the top of the slide again. Keep that tune in your mind. The second movement features a kind of duet between the soprano soloist and the bass soloist. And the bass sings a complicated and very busy line, whilst the soprano sings the Ein fester Burg melody, but also with some decoration or ornamentation, if you like, in her part. So see if you can make that out. My final example comes from the fifth movement, where now the melody is sung in unison by all the voices of the choir. And Bach also changes the rhythmic feel of this movement too by using triplets in the orchestra. So here's an example of that. And Bach remained in Leipzig up until 1750, the year of his death. During the final 5 years of his life, he went on to write some of his greatest and grandest works. And these included the Two Passions, the Mass in B minor that was written for the Catholic court in Dresden, and the Christmas Oratorio. And in many ways, these works, written in the final years of Bach's life, are like a summing up of everything that had been done before and a summing up of the whole Baroque period. Change was very much in the air around this time, and younger composers were seeking out new ways, and these works represent the end of a magnificent era. So that sort of takes me along to the next composer that I want to look at. Also a very important figure in the Baroque period, George Friedrich Handel. Handel led a much more sort of extroverted life than Bach. Bach worked away quietly in his various appointments, whereas Handel was always in the public eye. He was very famous at the time. If you remember what I said last time, J.S. Bach didn't really become famous until about a century after his death. They were both known as organists and great improvisers. But like I said, Handel was celebrated during his lifetime as a great composer. Another difference between the two is that Bach never really travelled very much geographically. He didn't move much from one job to the next, whereas Handel travelled more widely. Handel was born in Halle in Germany in the same year as Bach in 1685. Halle is very, very close to Leipzig, but Handel left when he was old enough to, and as far as we know, Bach and Handel never ever met, although they of course knew of each other. Handel was a brilliant young composer whose musical tastes were very different from Bach's. His interest was in writing operas in the Italian style, which were very, very popular in Germany at this time. Bach was a staunchly Protestant and had no time for these sort of entertainment things like opera. Handel travelled to Italy and studied widely in Florence, Rome, Naples, and Venice, where he wrote more operas, including Axis, Galatea e Polifermo in 1708, which later was reworked into English and became his most successful opera. And in Italy, he also composed secular, i.e. non-religious cantatas, Catholic church music, and oratorios, and was widely praised by the Italians. Next, Handel worked in Germany as Kapellmeister to the Elector of Hanover, who was a prince, during which time he took leave leave to visit London. There, he was an immediate success with his opera Rinaldo. He did return to Hanover, but he didn't stick around for long. And in 1712, he again obtained permission to go back to London, which he was granted provided he only went for a short time. But he broke that agreement and settled in London permanently and became a naturalised British citizen. The Elector of Hanover was not very happy about this, but in 1714, on the death of Queen Anne, he became the King of Great Britain. He was in fact the closest Protestant relative to Queen Anne. Catholics were at that time forbidden to accede the throne. Anne had over 50 closer relatives, but they were all Catholic. So suddenly, the new King George I of England was able to put aside the insult of Handel having gone astray, and the two were reconciled. One of the most striking features of Handel's music was his ability to write lots of grand ceremonial music, and he wrote a lot of this for royal occasions. One famous such event was the journey down the River Thames by the king and his party, accompanied by Handel's music that's always become known as the water music. The musicians sat in a barge that sailed along beside the king's barge and serenaded him with this sound. And that was then followed by this. And the King of England was so delighted by this music that he ordered it to be repeated at least 3 times. Another of Handel's most celebrated works, Zadok the Priest, was written for the coronation of King George II in 1727, and it's been played at all British coronations since then. It's what we call an anthem. Handel had this amazing gift for being able to write powerful ceremonial music. So he could produce simple but very, very striking melodies that sounded very, very grandiose when performed by large orchestral forces. And he applied this skill superbly in a lot of his music, including his oratorios, which I think I'll look at with you next time. Most notably the Hallelujah Chorus, which I'm sure most of you will know. So, as I said, it's been performed at every single British coronation since then. So what I'd like to show you is a brief snippet of the coronation, the most recent British coronation, that of Elizabeth II in 1953. So the video quality is obviously 65, 66 years old. So, but it's still hopefully gives you a good idea of just how ceremonial this music is.
Of Handel setting linen garment. In this garment of white, in such contrast to the splendors about her, she will move for the first time to King Edward's chair.
So now, just whilst I'm just setting up this next slide, there we go. Now I'll talk you through a little bit about Baroque orchestras, because they're quite different from today. And to do that, I'd like to focus on another of Handel's great ceremonial pieces, the music for the royal fireworks. I'll give you a little bit of background first. Yes, so a bit of background, sorry. Again, this was performed at one of the King's great ceremonies. It was performed in Green Park in London, and the music was once again, just like the water music and Zadok the Priest, the music was a great success. However, the fireworks were not so successful. There was some rain in the air at the time, and that meant a lot of the fireworks didn't go off as planned. Of those that did manage to work, one firework set fire to one of the park's pavilions, and another set fire, a stray rocket set fire to a woman's clothes. So the firework display wasn't so good, but the music was a great success. So let's use the music for the royal fireworks to talk through some of the differences between Baroque instruments and modern day instruments. So first of all, we have two pictures of Baroque oboes here. We have the oboes d'amore, which are slightly lower in range, a lower pitch than modern day equivalents. And then we also have oboes da caccia, which are shaped more like a hunting horn. So very, very different from the oboes that you might know today. The music for the royal fireworks also asks for 12 bassoons and one contrabassoon. Here's a picture of a Baroque bassoon. Again, as you can see, it's quite a different wood, quite a different design to modern day bassoons. I'll just pop back. Handel asks for 24 oboes to be playing in the music for the royal fireworks. That's a huge number of oboes. If you compare that to Beethoven or Mozart, who came sort of 60, 70 years later than this was written, Handel's actually asking for a lot more oboes than later composers, orchestral composers were. We have the trumpets are very, very different. They weren't the valve trumpets that we know of today, but they used what we call natural trumpets. There's a picture there on the left of one. These are extremely difficult to play and very, very difficult to avoid splitting notes. You have to have incredibly good stamina and really, really know your instrument well to be able to pitch the notes in tune and not split any of them and make the kind of sound that is expected of you. So these are fiendishly difficult to play. On the right is a famous trumpeter. In fact, this was J.S. Bach's trumpeter called Gottfried Reicher, famous trumpeter in Bach's day. And we know that he was a musician of great skill. We can tell this because Bach wrote extremely difficult trumpet parts, and all of those trumpet parts were written for this chap, Reicher. Indeed, after a performance in Leipzig, whilst walking home, Reicher, in fact, died of a stroke, and it's believed, I don't know how true this story is, but it's believed that the reason behind his death was because of excessive trumpet playing the natural trumpet. Again, very, very difficult to play. You have to have a huge amount of breath, using your lungs all the time, and it's rumored that he in fact died from overplaying his trumpet. I'll leave you to investigate that story further. We also have hunting horns, and Handel asks for 9 natural horns, which look like this. Again, very, very different to horns today, more like what we would know to be hunting horns. He also asks for 3 pairs of timpani or kettle drums. Again, these are not the pedal type timpani that we see in orchestras and bands today, but these ones are hand tuned, made of copper. And the skins are animal skin rather than plastic heads like we know today. And again, these are very, very difficult to keep in tune. The slightest variation of temperature inside the performance venue, and these are going to go very, very flat or very, very sharp very, very quickly. So they're actually very difficult to play. And these timpani, kettle drums, come from the military. And again, they just contribute to the sort of grandiose ceremonial effect that Handel wanted to achieve in his music. Handel also asks for snare drums to be played ad lib. Handel didn't write any specific parts for snare drums, but he did expect in the more ceremonial passages of the Royal Fireworks music, he did expect the snare drums to improvise a sort of militaristic sounding part. So the original Royal Fireworks music was only written for winds, brass and percussion, but then Handel rescored the music for full orchestra for a later performance at the Foundling Hospital in London, and it's in this that he incorporated strings. Violin, viola, cello, double bass, lute, chitarroni. And again, stringed instruments were quite different from today. I'm not a string player, so I'm not a great expert in this, but to give you a very basic overview, the fingerboard on a Baroque violin is much shorter than modern equivalents. Baroque violins use gut strings. The bows are generally straight or perhaps slightly bent outwards in the middle. And chin rests and shoulder rests are not used. Instead, the violin is held against the left chest below the shoulder. In terms of playing, Baroque violinists use very, very little vibrato. That is not a feature of Baroque violin playing generally. It can occasionally be used for special effects, but generally Baroque players use very, very little vibrato. So there's some of the differences there. The 2 pictures you see, the one on the left is a lute, and the one on the right is a chitarroni that would have been used in the string section in a lot of Baroque orchestras at this time. So what we're going to do now is we're going to turn our attention to what we call a period ensemble. A period ensemble is an orchestra today, so a modern day orchestra, but that uses either original instruments from Handel's time or replica instruments. So it sounds very, very different to if this was played by a modern orchestra like the NZSO or APO. Here we're going to hear a performance by the combined orchestras of the Freiburg Baroque Orchestra, a German orchestra, and the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment from London in the UK. These are 2 of the greatest Baroque orchestras in the world at the moment. A few things to look out for. You'll first of all notice that they do not have a conductor. This was normal at this time, and it's the first violinist, the lead violinist, that has to direct the orchestra whilst playing his instrument. The leader is Gottfried von der Goltz, one of the finest Baroque violinists in the world at the moment. So really, if you're a musician in a Baroque orchestra, you have to communicate with the other players, watch and listen a lot more, or even more, I should say, than you do in a modern day orchestra. So we're going to hear a few examples of this. We're going to listen to the very beginning and try and spot some of the different sounds they make, how it's different to a modern orchestra, and hopefully you'll see some of the instruments that I pointed out a few moments ago. So yes, it starts off with huge orchestral forces, very, very powerful ceremonial music. You can probably tell why the King of England might have really appreciated music being written in this way. Very simple melodies, simple catchy tunes, nothing like the complexity that we see in Bach's music, but very, very effective for the circumstances that it was being written for. Let's move on to a quieter section of the fireworks music, just so you can see some of the strings and woodwinds in action more. One of the things I noticed really about what amazes me about the trumpets is just how effortless it looks. These are incredibly difficult instruments to play, and yet these musicians make it look almost just effortless. It's just incredible. Here's a different section. And then finally, just to finish things off, I'll show you the triumphant ending from the minuet. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. What I would like to encourage you to do is just use YouTube and Spotify, iTunes, whatever you can find, to listen to some more Baroque orchestras. I especially recommend the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment and the Freiburg Baroque. And just check out some of their performances. A lot of things will be available online. A lot of things will be available for free at this time because of the COVID-19 situation. So I just urge you to listen to as much as you can and try to get an appreciation of how different musical instruments sounded 200 to 300 years ago compared to what they sound like today. So I wish you a good week, and I hope you get to make some music. And good luck with the master classes and performance classes. And I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye bye.